"That's enough, Susan," my mom exclaimed, her voice trembling with frustration as she leaned forward, her glare piercing through me across the dining table. The twinkling lights on the Christmas tree seemed almost mocking, casting a warm glow over an otherwise tense and suffocating atmosphere. I sat stiffly, my hands gripping the edges of my chair as I struggled to contain the frustration rising inside me. My dad's voice followed, sharp and unforgiving. "You always find a way to make everything about yourself." His words stung, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. My name is Susan Blanchard, and I was 32 years old when this happened. It was the late 1970s, a time when family loyalty meant everything, especially in our little rural corner of Illinois. Our family farm had been the backbone of our lives for generations, but it was teetering on the edge of ruin. Years ago, I'd left to build a life for myself in Chicago, pursuing a career as a lawyer, a choice my parents saw as a betrayal of our roots. Meanwhile, my older brother Jake stayed behind, running the farm and basking in their constant approval. I didn't resent Jake for staying, but I couldn't ignore the way I was treated like an outsider. No matter what I did. Since the summer, I'd been quietly sending money to the farm's shared account to help cover the growing pile of bills. Jake had convinced me to keep it a secret, claiming that telling our parents would hurt their pride. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, sitting at that table on Christmas Eve, I realized the truth. Jake had been taking credit for every dollar I sent. "Jake is the reason this farm is still standing," my mom said, her voice thick with pride. "Without him, we'd have lost everything by now." I turned to look at Jake, expecting at least a flicker of guilt in his expression. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking like he was enjoying the whole charade. That was when I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Actually," I said, my voice trembling but determined enough to cut through the noise, "I've been the one sending the money every month since July." My dad immediately scoffed, shaking his head as if I'd just told the most absurd lie imaginable. "Oh, don't start with this nonsense, Susan. Jake's been here every day, breaking his back for this family. Why would you even say something like that?" His dismissive tone made my chest tighten, but my mom's response was worse. She crossed her arms and gave me a look of pure disdain. "You've always had a way of trying to make everything about you. It's Christmas, Susan. Can we just have one evening without your drama?" I stared at them, my frustration bubbling into anger. How could they be so blind? How could Jake sit there, letting them heap praise on him for something he hadn't done? I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for recognition. I was fighting for the truth. As I stood there, heart pounding and fists clenched, I knew I couldn't win this fight tonight. The room was thick with denial, my parents siding with Jake's every shrug and smirk. But I also knew I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. "Fine," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "You want proof? I'll get it. Tomorrow, I'm driving back to Chicago, and I'll bring back every receipt, every bank record, and every single deposit slip that shows exactly where the money came from." Jake didn't flinch. He leaned back casually, a smirk playing on his lips. "Do what you want, Susan. But honestly, I think you're making a fool of yourself." His arrogance was infuriating, but it only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to waste another second arguing with someone who wasn't even willing to acknowledge the truth. I turned to my parents, my gaze unwavering. "When I come back with proof, I hope you'll finally see what's been going on. Until then, enjoy the rest of your evening." Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my coat and walked out the front door, the cold Illinois air biting at my face. As I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the hurt and frustration hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of feeling like I didn't belong, the constant comparisons to Jake, and the way my parents always seemed to believe the worst about me. But this time, I had the truth on my side, and I wasn't going to let it be buried under Jake's lies. The next morning, I packed my things and left before anyone else woke up. The drive back to Chicago was long, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional churn of my thoughts. By the time I reached the city, my determination had hardened into a plan. At the bank, I requested copies of every deposit I'd made into the farm account. The teller was thorough, handing me a neat stack of records that detailed every transfer. As I stared at the documents in my hands, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. This was it, irrefutable proof of what I'd been doing for months. I drove back to Illinois the same day, the records sitting in the passenger seat like my own personal shield. By the time I arrived at the farm, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered fields. I walked into the house, my boots crunching against the icy steps, and found my family in the living room. My parents looked up, surprised to see me back so soon, while Jake barely acknowledged my presence. "I'm back," I announced, holding up the stack of papers. "And I've got the proof." The room fell silent as I spread the documents out on the coffee table. My parents leaned forward, their eyes scanning the dates, amounts, and account numbers. Each record pointed to one undeniable fact. Every single deposit came from me. Jake's smirk finally disappeared. For the first time, he looked nervous. "I told you," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "I've been sending the money. Not Jake. Me." My mom's face paled as she pieced it together. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "Is this true? Did you take credit for Susan's money?" Jake hesitated, his usual confidence replaced by a stammering attempt to explain. I didn't lie. I didn't think it mattered where the money came from as long as the farm got it." "It matters," my dad said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "It matters that you lied to us. And it matters that Susan sacrificed so much while you took all the credit." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the look on my dad's face. For the first time in years, I felt seen. My mom turned to me, her eyes filled with regret. "Susan," she said softly, "we owe you an apology. We were wrong to doubt you. We've been wrong about so much." I nodded, accepting her words, but knowing it would take time to truly forgive. That Christmas, the truth finally came out. It wasn't the warm, cheerful holiday I'd hoped for, but it was the first time I stood up for myself and won. And that, in its own way, was enough. I thanked the teller, clutching the stack of receipts tightly as I walked back to my car. My breath clouded in the freezing air, but I barely noticed. These receipts were my proof, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. Jake couldn't talk his way out of this. The drive back to Illinois felt different this time. I wasn't replaying old arguments or questioning myself. I was focused, determined to set the record straight. Every mile brought me closer to exposing Jake's lies and reclaiming my place in the family. When I arrived at the farm later that afternoon, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields. I stepped into the house, the warmth of the wood stove hitting me as I took off my coat. My parents were in the kitchen, chatting quietly, while Jake lounged in the living room with a smug look plastered across his face. "Back so soon?" Jake asked, barely glancing up. "I thought you were done with us." Ignoring him, I walked into the living room and placed the stack of receipts on the coffee table. "What's this?" my dad asked, walking over with my mom trailing behind. "Proof," I said firmly. "Every deposit I made into the farm account since July. You can see the dates, the amounts, and my name on every single one." My dad picked up the first receipt, his brow furrowing as he examined it. My mom took one, too, her eyes widening as she read the details. "Susan's name," she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Every deposit, it's all her." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he still tried to play it cool. "So what?" he said with a shrug. "Maybe you sent some money. That doesn't mean I didn't contribute." "You didn't contribute a single dime," I snapped. "Every dollar in that account since July came from me. And you've been sitting here, letting them believe it was you." The color drained from Jake's face as my dad turned to him, holding the receipts like they were evidence in a trial. "Jake," my dad said, his voice low and tense, "is this true?" Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Answer me," my mom demanded, her voice sharp. Finally, Jake let out a bitter laugh, throwing up his hands. "Fine," he admitted. "Yeah, she sent the money. But does it really matter? The farm stayed afloat, didn't it? What difference does it make who sent it?" "It makes all the difference," my dad said, his voice shaking with anger. "You lied to us, Jake. You let us believe you were carrying this family when it was Susan the whole time." Jake tried to argue, but my mom cut him off. "Enough," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "You took advantage of your sister, and you made us doubt her. I can't believe you'd do something like this." Jake slumped back into his chair, his bravado completely gone. For the first time in years, I felt seen. My mom turned to me, her voice soft and full of regret. "Susan, I'm so sorry. We should have believed you. We owe you an apology, no, more than that. We owe you everything." My dad nodded, his face lined with guilt. "You've done more for this family than we ever gave you credit for. And we were wrong to take Jake's word over yours. Can you forgive us?" I took a deep breath, the weight of the past few days and years finally lifting. "It's going to take time," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." That Christmas, the truth finally came out. It wasn't the warm, festive holiday I'd hoped for, but it was a turning point. My parents had finally seen Jake for who he was and me for what I had done for them. As I drove back to Chicago the next day, I felt a sense of closure. I had stood up for myself, and for the first time, I had won. I crossed my arms, refusing to back down. And I said I've been the one sending the money. Those receipts prove it. Every single deposit came from me, not Jake. My dad looked up, his expression shifting from disbelief to something darker, guilt. My mom, too, stared at the stack of receipts, her face pale. "Jake," my dad said, his voice low and sharp. "Care to explain this?" Jake shrugged, trying to play it off. "Look, does it really matter who sent the money? The farm stayed afloat, didn't it?" My mom's voice cut through the air, trembling with anger. "It matters because you lied to us. You let us believe you were the one making sacrifices, Jake, while your sister was the one helping us all along." Jake rolled his eyes, tossing the apple core into the trash. "Fine, I didn't send the money. But I've been here, working the farm, dealing with everything while Susan ran off to the city. I figured she owed us something." The words hit me like a slap. "Owed you?" I shot back, my voice rising. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I've helped this family without asking for anything in return. And you think I owe you?" My dad slammed his hand on the table, silencing both of us. "Enough," he barked, his face flushed. He turned to Jake, his expression hard. "You've lied to us, taken credit for something you didn't do, and made a fool out of your sister. This is unacceptable." Jake's confident facade cracked, and for the first time, he looked uneasy. My mom, still staring at the receipts, shook her head. "Susan," she said softly, her voice breaking, "we owe you an apology. A huge one. I can't believe we doubted you." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I forced myself to stay composed. "I don't need an apology, Mom," I said quietly. "I just need you to see the truth. I've been helping because I wanted to, not because I needed recognition. But I won't let Jake take credit for what I've done." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Finally, my dad stood up, his shoulders heavy with regret. "You're right," he said. "We've been blind, and that's on us. You deserve better, Susan. We see that now." Jake muttered something under his breath, but one sharp look from my mom silenced him. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest easing slightly. For the first time, I felt like they were really listening to me, seeing me for who I was and what I'd done. It wasn't the perfect resolution. The hurt and resentment didn't disappear overnight. But it was a start. As I gathered my things to leave later that evening, my mom hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. "We'll make this right," she promised. Driving back to Chicago, I finally felt a sense of closure. It wasn't just about proving Jake wrong, it was about standing up for myself, reclaiming my voice, and demanding the respect I deserved. This time, I knew they'd remember. The air felt heavy as I grabbed my coat, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. My family's betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. I had come here with the truth, with tangible proof, and they still refused to believe me. Worse, they treated me like I was the villain. "You'll regret this," I said, my voice low but steady. "One day, you'll realize you pushed away the only person who actually had your back." I turned to leave, but not before glancing at Jake one last time. His smug expression hadn't faltered. It was like he was basking in my humiliation, confident that he had won yet again. "Enjoy the hero worship while it lasts," I added, my words laced with venom. "Because when the truth comes out, and it will come out, you'll have no one to hide behind." With that, I slammed the door behind me, the cold night air biting at my face as I marched to my car. As I drove away, the farmhouse lights faded into the distance, but the sting of their disbelief lingered. I had tried so hard to help them, to prove myself worthy of their respect, and all I got in return was rejection and ridicule. The thought of never coming back crossed my mind more than once during the long, quiet drive back to Chicago. But a part of me still held onto a sliver of hope. They would have to face the truth eventually, whether through the bank or the consequences of Jake's lies catching up to him. For now, I would focus on my own life, on moving forward without the weight of their judgment holding me back. They had made their choice, and so had I. This time, I wasn't going to let them drag me down. The silence stretched as I stood across from them, arms crossed, waiting for one of them to speak. My dad cleared his throat, but it was my mom who finally broke the tension. We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide my skepticism. "About what?" She exchanged a glance with my dad, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You were right," my dad said finally, his voice low and filled with regret. "About everything." The words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I'd imagined this moment, but now that it was happening, it didn't feel satisfying, just hollow. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone even. My mom let out a shaky sigh. "After you stopped sending the money, things started to fall apart. The bills kept coming, and Jake, he couldn't handle it." I stayed silent, letting them continue. He kept saying he'd figure it out, but it just got worse. My dad admitted. We started asking questions, and eventually, the truth came out. He finally admitted that it was you sending the money all along. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "So now you believe me," I said flatly. My mom flinched at the bitterness in my tone. "We're sorry, Susan," she said, her voice breaking. "We should have believed you from the start. We let Jake manipulate us, and we took you for granted. We're here to make things right." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "It took the farm falling apart for you to finally see the truth? Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to be called a liar in front of the entire family? To watch you defend Jake while dismissing me?" My dad hung his head, guilt etched into his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "We were wrong, and we're sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, but the anger I'd been holding onto for months refused to let go so easily. "You didn't just hurt me," I said, my voice trembling. "You pushed me away. You made it clear that no matter what I did, I'd never be enough." My mom reached out as if to touch my hand, but I stepped back. "Please, Susan," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "We want to fix this." I looked at them, torn between the love I still felt for them and the pain they'd caused. Finally, I spoke. "I can't just forget what happened," I said. "It's going to take time for me to trust you again, to even want a relationship with you. You need to understand that." They nodded, their faces heavy with remorse. "We understand," my dad said quietly, "and we're willing to do whatever it takes." For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't happen overnight. "I'm not making any promises," I said firmly. But if you're serious about making things right, you'll have to prove it. They nodded again. And as they left my apartment, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and the faintest flicker of hope. This wasn't the resolution I'd dreamed of, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrest of the chair. "So he's sorry now?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sorry after the bills started piling up? After I left? Funny how easy it is to feel sorry when you're caught." My mom winced, and my dad shifted uncomfortably, but neither of them contradicted me. They couldn't, and they knew it. "I needed you to believe me when it mattered," I continued, my voice trembling with anger. "Instead, you chose to trust Jake because it was easier. Because he was the one who stayed behind. The one who fit into your idea of what a child should be. And now that everything's falling apart, you come here, expecting me to just what? Forgive and forget?" My dad raised his hands in a placating gesture. "We're not asking you to forget, Susan," he said, his tone earnest. "We're asking for a chance to make things right. We know we've hurt you. We know we failed you." My mom's voice cracked as she added, "We don't deserve it, but we want to rebuild things with you, with our family. Please, Susan." I stared at them, their remorse plain on their faces. A part of me wanted to yell, to make them feel a fraction of the hurt I'd carried for months. But another part of me, smaller but persistent, wanted to believe they were sincere. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice softer but no less firm. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'll think about it." Relief flickered in my mom's eyes, and she nodded quickly. "That's all we can ask for," she said. "Don't expect me to go running back to the farm," I warned, standing up. "Jake made his bed, and now he can lie in it. If the farm's struggling, that's on him, and on you for enabling him." My dad opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "You both let him take credit for my work, and you dismiss me like I was nothing. That doesn't get fixed with an apology." They nodded, their silence an acknowledgement of the truth in my words. "I need time," I said, walking to the door. "Don't call me. Don't visit again until I'm ready to talk. And don't expect me to sweep this under the rug." They stood, hesitant but understanding, and my dad said, "We'll wait as long as you need. Susan, we're sorry." As I closed the door behind them, I felt an odd mix of emotions, relief, anger, and an ache that refused to go away. They had finally acknowledged the truth. But it didn't erase the months of pain or the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family. This wasn't the end of the story, but for now, it was enough. I wasn't ready to forgive. And I wasn't sure I ever would be. But at least, for the first time, they had seen the truth, and that was a start. As the door closed, the silence in my apartment felt deafening. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where my parents had just been, my emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. Their apologies, though long overdue, still felt hollow. Words couldn't erase the years of favoritism or the sting of being dismissed time and time again. And Jake, not even having the courage to show up, that hurt the most. He had taken so much from me, yet he didn't have the decency to face me and admit it. I sank into the chair, letting out a shaky breath. A part of me wanted to cry, to scream, to let it all out, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the stack of receipts still sitting on the coffee table. They were a reminder of everything I'd done, everything they had refused to see. I flipped through them, each one a tangible piece of the truth I had fought so hard to prove. Maybe they had finally started to see it, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. For the first time, I felt a sliver of peace. Not because they had apologized, but because I had stood my ground. I had made them confront the reality they had spent years ignoring. And no matter how uncomfortable it had been for them, they couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't closure, it was just the beginning of me reclaiming my voice, my worth, and my place in the world. I placed the receipts back on the table and stood up, staring out the window at the bustling city below. The weight of the farm, my parents' expectations, and Jake's manipulations no longer felt like chains holding me down. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done living in their shadow. This was my life, and I was finally ready to live it on my own terms. For a long time, I sat in silence, the weight of their regret lingering like a shadow in the room. For the first time, I felt that they truly understood, not just my words, but everything I had endured. It was bittersweet, a small victory in a sea of unresolved pain. A week later, another knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, my heart sank. Jake stood there, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets, looking more defeated than I had ever seen him. "Susan," he said softly, his voice hesitant. "Can I come in?" I considered slamming the door in his face, but stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He didn't sit or take off his jacket. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, shifting his weight like a child about to confess a broken vase. "I came to apologize," he started, his voice low and uneven. "For everything, for lying, for taking credit for the money you sent, for letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did." I said nothing, crossing my arms as I waited for him to continue. "I don't have an excuse," he admitted, his voice trembling. "I was jealous of you, Susan. You've done so much with your life, and I stayed behind. I thought if I could just keep their approval, I'd feel, I don't know, important, I guess. But it was wrong, all of it." His voice cracked, and then, to my shock, he dropped his head into his hands and started sobbing. Heavy, gut-wrenching sobs that shook his whole frame. This wasn't the controlled guilt of someone seeking forgiveness for appearance's sake. This was raw, ugly regret, the kind that strips you bare. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure how to respond. My parents didn't call right away, but when they finally did, their tone was unrecognizable. No more defensiveness, no excuses, no attempts to downplay what had happened. They didn't explicitly say it, but I could tell they had stopped shielding Jake. My dad mentioned that they'd taken over the farm finances themselves, and my mom admitted, almost in passing, that Jake was working to earn back their trust. It wasn't everything, but it was something. As for Jake, he kept his distance after that apology, which was fine by me. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but for the first time, I felt that he was genuinely trying. Things with my parents weren't perfect, but they were finally fair. That was enough for me.